So Arlecchino's kit is out now and we know what it is, but people seem to be incredibly confused, and the more people try to explain it, the more confused people get. Her kit is very hard to understand, so I'm going to break it down in the simplest terms possible because I feel people are extremely frustrated and not fully understanding what she actually does, all these weird stacks that she does. So let's keep it simple and we'll go over it. First things first, her elemental burst and her skill are all going to cater to her normal attacks. Her normal attacks are going to be the key here. So for starters, she's an on-field DPS pyro polearm, and her polearm was leaked to be a scythe, and it's true. She focuses on regular attacks. This is important, we'll get into this in a second. Regular attacks, and she scales off attack as well. She has a crit damage ascension stat, and she cannot be healed. She will not synergize with healers such as Farina, forget that. We'll elaborate on that as well in a second, but they seem to specifically not want her to work with Farina, which is an interesting choice. So let's simplify her kit now. And in order to make it make sense, we're going to talk about her normal attacks last, because her passive talents, her skill, and her burst all cater to her regular attacks and gaining these weird stacks that no one seems to understand. So let's start with that. Let's start with her elemental skill. She dashes forward to nearby enemy, dealing area of effect pyro damage, pretty straightforward slash, but the catch is all of the stacks that you have accumulated through her regular attacks disappear and you're healed. What then happens with your skill is that enemies that you just hit are marked. Marked enemies take pyro damage every 3 seconds up to 3 times. So 9 seconds total for these marked enemies to take interval damage. And if you perform a charge attack on these enemies that are marked with this mark, you'll gain 80% stacks. This is important. Her elemental burst is pretty straightforward. It costs 60 energy, the cooldown is 15 seconds, she does a big area of effect pyro damage attack and gains 15% stacks. All of these stacks go towards her regular attack. We'll get into that in a second. Her passive skill number 1. If you kill an enemy that's marked from her skill, that same thing that intervals 3 seconds, a total of 9 seconds because it does it 3 times. If one of these enemies that's marked with this is killed, you're automatically going to gain 70% of this stack. This stack system to work, you only need 30%. Everything else is extra damage, but it needs 30% to activate. Through her skill, her burst, and her passives, you should hit well over 30 no problem. Just killing a marked target from her skill will give you 70% stack. When using a charge attack against one of these marked enemies, you'll gain either 20%, 25%, or 70% of this stack. Which percentage you gain depends on how many times the marked enemy ticks. We just talked about how these marked enemies get interval damage every 3 seconds. So on that third interval, so 9 seconds in, that's when you get the 70% stat. But if you're hitting a bunch of enemies, or depending on how many enemies are actually tagged, you don't have to let it tick out that long, or you can just hopefully kill the enemy and get the 70% stack right away. This is where everyone gets confused. If these marked enemies get hit after the first tick, 20% stack, the second tick, 25% stack, but if it's the third time around, which will be 9 seconds into them being marked, and the last time they'll tick, boom, 70%. Hopefully you can just kill the marked target and get the 70% Bond of Life stack immediately. For her second passive, every 100 attack over 1000 attack she has will give her 1% more damage resistance, and because she can't be healed, this is kind of good. And this can max out to 20%. Just want to have her attack stat up to 3000 to get the max, which shouldn't be hard to do, especially if you're going for her signature weapon. When she's on field, she cannot be healed by other party members. Anybody that heals you, she won't benefit from at all, but she can heal herself through her skill. Her self-healing doesn't seem to be miraculous by any means, but I don't know how sufficient it'll be. She'll probably do really well with shielders, to be honest, but it really depends how frail she actually is. Now we can finally go to her normal attack. So her normal attack, unlike other characters that just have regular generic attacks, she does as well, but it has a little secret mechanic built in. When she accumulates, like we talked about, 30% total Bond of Life stacks, she gains 40% pyro damage bonus and pyro infusion. During pyro infusion, she gains bonus damage based on the stacks she's gained. Like we just talked about, with her skill, you gain stacks, charge attacks, and with your passives and your burst, you're going to gain a bunch of stacks along the way. So hitting 30% to activate this hidden talent within her regular attacks should not be hard at all. And when you use her skill, this should be the time you're prepping to restart the cycle. You use her skill, you mark these enemies, and these marked enemies will take intermittent pyro damage for every 3 seconds up to 3 times, 9 seconds total. And during this time, with her passives, whether you're using charge attacks or you're actually killing these enemies, you're going to gain a crap ton of these stacks, 70% or 20% depending on how many ticks go by and how many enemies you're dealing with. Then when you pop her burst, which is only 60 energy cost, you're going to gain additional 15% stack as well as doing a big area of effect pyro damage. Essentially, you're just popping her skill and her burst. Actually, because her burst has 15-second cooldown, I'd use her burst first, area effect pyro damage, you get a 15% stack, you're halfway to 30 already. Use her skill, tag those enemies up. Then you just start using her regular attacks. Start using charge attacks, and start killing some enemies. Gain these stacks up, and the more stacks you gain, you'll probably almost immediately hit the 30, and probably go beyond. Then you gain the pyro infusion and 40% damage bonus to pyro. Boom, now you're rolling. Once you need to do your rotations, you switch to your other characters, your supports, you do their stuff. You switch back to Arlecchino, you start with her burst. If it's charged up, it should be by now, because you used it first last time. Used her burst, use her skill again, tag those enemies again, start accumulating those stacks, and boom, rinse and repeat. I'm not going to dissect numbers right now because she's very early beta and a lot's going to change, but I really want to know how it's going to measure up against like a big single target, like a big boss in the Abyss, or a group of enemies. It sounds to me that she's going to gain a shit ton more damage through these stacks, having a lot more enemies she's hitting all at once that are tagged up from her skill, rather than just trying to accumulate these stacks from a big ass boss and there just being one enemy. But again, it's hard to really visualize when you're just reading it. And obviously off the top of my head, she's not going to work well with any healers. Bennett, she'll still work really well with. Chivalrous as well. She won't gain any of the healing benefits from those characters, but the buffs that they give, like Overload buff or Benny's buffs that he buffs everybody, she'll still get those buffs. She's obviously going to be good with characters like Yelan and Xingqiu, Zheng Li, and Toma, any kind of shielders. Honestly, Kazuha, there's a lot of team comps I think she'll be pretty good at. Vaporize, Overload. I don't think her pyro application is going to be really high or anything like that. I think her damage will be quite damn good, just from what I can see. She just has to sustain herself, unless she has a shielder. And as long as you have 3,000 attack, she's going to gain 20% resistance, so that'll help with sustainability, as well as how she heals herself. How frail she'll actually be though, and how much of a liability against the stronger enemies, I have no idea. It's really hard to say, but hitting that 3,000 attack shouldn't be too hard, seeing as that she scales off attack. Her weapon also has 672 attack with a 22% crit rate, and her signature weapon also gives you these Bond of Life stacks, so her weapon is very much niche to herself. I wouldn't buy her weapon if you're planning on using it on like Hu Tao or something. They won't benefit from these stacks whatsoever. But I hope this breakdown was easy and simple to follow. We'll know more as the beta goes, and you know, they're probably going to make some tweaks and changes, but I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'm going to be doing a farming guide for Arlecchino as well. But like and subscribe, help grow the channel. If you enjoyed this, I appreciate it. And as always, we will see you all in the next one. Later.